I would like to welcome to the stage the creator of Ruby on Rails, David Heinemeier Hansson.
Hi, and welcome. I just go chat's thoughts here. I'm going to be talking about Rails 3 for a bit today. I have a secret to share as well. Is my mic going out as well? All right, great. But before I get into that, I actually want to take sort of a slight step back. This year marks the 5th year that I have been working with Ruby on Rails as sort of a released platform. Well, actually, I've been working with it for a year prior to that. So 6 years for me and 5 years for anybody who joined the band in the early days. And I think that's really quite a significant milestone for us in terms of just how much we've been through in that period of time, how much has changed. And I think perhaps what's more interesting to me than how much have changed is all the things that haven't changed. We constantly talk about how fast everything is moving in the Ruby on Rails world, and that's true on a very micro level. I don't think it's very true on a macro level. I think we are largely doing the same things today as we were doing 5 years ago. And I think the bulk of what's going on and why we continue to enjoy what we do really hasn't changed. So I think the first message I'd like to come out with is just stop fretting so much about whether you are up to date with the latest and the greatest. I was just looking at some of my Rails code that I have that's actually 5 or more years old recently. And what I found was that even though a fair amount of the idioms looked a little dated and a little dusty, it really wasn't that much of a big deal. So if you joined Rails 5 years ago, or you joined 3 years ago, or 1 year ago, we just had one guy talking about how REST, now he has to rewrite all his applications to come up with that. I don't think that's really true. I think you can very much enjoy Rails even though you don't know everything that's going on, and you don't need to rewrite your application every single time something new comes up. But in any case, we've been around for 5 years, and that wasn't a foregone conclusion 5 years ago. When I started talking about Ruby on Rails in 2004 and beyond, there were all these things that were supposed to have killed Rails. All these mortal wounds that we sustained over the years that, according to reputable sources such as Reddit and Slashdot, was supposed to have taken us down long, long ago. So I want to take just a brief moment to go through a gallery of all of those mortal wounds, or some of them at least. There's too many for me to go through all of them, and reflect a little bit about what caused it and what we sort of learned from it. So if we start from the beginning, one of the very first things that was supposed to have kept Rails from getting any long-term interest was that it wasn't enterprise ready. And I really enjoyed those early days because it was in some ways much more of an intense struggle, and out of that struggle came some really interesting characters. One of the guys I really appreciated for all the laughs was a guy called James McGovern, who was, I think, an analyst or an architect or some other bullshit title at a big company, who said, you may have noticed that pretty much everyone in the Ruby canon are insultants, which is his clever word of consultants and insultants, with many of them being book authors attempting to capitalize on the hype. So this was a very strong meme in the beginning, that everybody was interested in Ruby on Rails just so they could sell consulting hours and so that they could sell books. And what all of this meant was that it really didn't have any bearing or relevance to the so-called enterprise. And in the beginning, my first reaction to that was sort of to fight it on a intellectual, logical level. That, well, it is suitable, it does fit, all of these things. And what I realized was that that's really useless. It doesn't really work. That's not really how technology gets adopted in the early times. some things is just a function of time. And as I was saying in the beginning, Rails today is really not all that different from Rails 5 years ago. Sure, it's better, faster, and so forth, but the fundamental principles are roughly the same. So if nothing has really changed between now and then, but we still have a lot of enterprise people coming into Ruby on Rails and discovering it these days, what I'm left with realizing is that some things just takes time. You're not going to win over everybody in the world just by having better arguments. Some arguments just take time to sink in. And I think that that's a lesson that's been valuable for me in all sorts of other things. When I started talking about REST at RailsConf 05 or 06 or something like that, I well knew that a lot of people were going to say that that doesn't seem to apply to me, this doesn't seem relevant, this isn't really anything that's interesting. But coming out of the experience of the enterprisey thing, I just realized that it's going to take some time. Most of these good ideas, everything from convention over configuration to REST and onwards, just takes time to be adopted from here on. So we shouldn't necessarily always be in such a rush. When you discover something new and interesting, whether it's something in the Ruby on Rails world, or it's Git, or it's any other piece of technology, don't be disillusioned early on just because people aren't getting your logical superior arguments. Because that's just setting yourself up for failure, not realizing how people adopt these things. The next sort of thing after saying, well, Rails isn't relevant at all, was sort of the counter to that. Rails is incredibly relevant, and now we just need to find that one magical piece. And if we can find that and clone that, Rails is no longer relevant again. So in the early days, there was a lot of web frameworks out there who very explicitly said that they had found the Rails formula. That now, because they cloned, say, scaffolding, Java was no longer painful. All right? Or any of these other ideas. And I think what I took away from this is that there's such an intense human sort of intention and approach to trying to boil things down. So when Ruby on Rails first hit the scene, there was all of these different angles, all of these different barriers that was pushing at, and people were desperately trying to find that there's got to be just one thing. There's this one thing we can boil it down to, and if we boil it down to that, we can replicate it, and thus we can replicate the whole thing. And we don't need to necessarily learn a new language or go too much further out on our comfort zone. And I think that that's later proven just to be a worthless exercise. Most things that are interesting in this world can't be boiled down to just one thing. Rails couldn't be boiled down to scaffolding. That wasn't the interesting part of it. And I think when we realize that ourselves, that it's not just about this one thing, we realize what it's all about, which is all about the unique details and sensibilities and individual choices there. And if we realize that that's really what's making us who we are, we can play a lot higher confidence in that and be more confident just talking about the simpler things, the individual details, not as any of them necessarily having to represent all it's about, but it being the sum of the parts. Now, in 2007, we had one of the high-profile switchbacks. Derek Sivers from CD Baby decided to make a blog post about how he was going back to PHP after 2 years on Rails. And this was really the interesting thing about hype and pushback is that they come in sort of waves. So up until this point, a lot of the articles have been all gushing about, how great Rails was and so on. And sort of to quote Cassie Sierra, that won't go on. You need balance in the universe. You need pushback. You need, as soon as you have a high, you need to somehow get down on earth again. And Derek delivered that for a lot of people by saying, I'm a person who uses Rails. It's no longer fitting to my needs. I need to go back. And that was sort of enough confirmation for a fair number of people saying, oh, that's great. Derek has just proved to me that there wasn't anything really there. So now I don't really have to occupy myself with it. I don't have to be guilty about not looking into it, and I can go back to my life just as it was. And naturally, I think a lot of people in the Rails community, again, tried to respond with these logical arguments. Derek was returning to using PHP because he already had a very large code base and he had all of these constraints and so on and so forth. But it didn't really stick and it didn't really matter. This was probably one of the more pivotal times where I realized just how little common threads on Slashdot, Reddit, Hacker News, and other places matter. Because all of these sort of communities erupted in this intense burst of energy for exactly 2 days. 2 days is the time it'll take for anything to scroll off any of these sites. And it's kind of very interesting that it's such a microcosm in that sense, that the storm is going to be incredibly intense for those 2 days. And it'll hopefully actually lead you to question a whole lot of things. But you have to keep that perspective in mind that, A, it doesn't really change a whole lot of people's opinions about anything, because anything that just lasts for 2 days usually doesn't. And anyway, that people don't change their mind just because of comment on Reddit. And that's okay. That it's okay that we can live with the fact that somebody can say, what you're using is no longer right for me, and you can move on, and we can still be friends about it. I still think that what Derek is doing as CD Baby is awesome, what he was doing before he was selling the company. And it doesn't really matter. We can still be friends, even though we choose not to use the same tools. Now, the fail whale, which is probably one of my favorite mortal wounds that Rails has sustained, because it reminds me that these things never really go away. So the core argument of the fail whale and whole Twitter debacle was the Rails doesn't scale, right? And that has really been an argument since the James McGovern days. In the beginning, the Rails didn't scale. And some memes are just so incredibly powerful that it's just useless for you to fight them. And you just have to embrace and accept that that's what's going on. And with Twitter, I found all of this sort of coming together in even more aggregated or ballooned ways in seeing that here you could have a service that people loved so dearly and they were so invested in it that it could be down what seemed like half of the time, and people really didn't care. Or they cared in their internet persona of being outraged. That's always caring, but it didn't really matter. And I think that that's one of the core principles of all of this, is that all of these top-level emotions that people have, these top-level reactions that people feel towards technology or events, they're just that. They're very surface level. And they don't necessarily change how people react and how they feel. So taking a step back and just realizing, hey, Rails actually has a poster board that's one of the most talked about web services of our current times, and they've had some problems. We can take the good with the bad. That just because they were having issues at a time, and whether it was Rails' fault or not, doesn't really matter. We can still work through this, and we can still be friends about it, even though there are all these conflict things. And I think that that's one of the sort of this shallow ends of all of this internet debate, is that it doesn't really allow a lot of people to reflect those conflicted emotions, that they can both at one time be proud of something and annoyed about something else. So all of these things were sort of external factors, external incidents that the Rails community have sort of had to deal with and react to. We've also had a fair amount of internal incidents within the community itself. One of the ones I don't actually have a slide for, but I found to be so interesting as just sort of some of these things were proxy battles, was the whole array, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and 42 methods that sort of created yet another one of those storms for 2 days. in that it wasn't really about that. It wasn't about whether Rails had added a few, in some minds, frivolous methods. It was more of a core underlying theme that was going on. And sometimes you have to dig a little for that. And what really exemplified this a lot better was the whole Murk thing. Murk was definitely the most credible internal alternative to Rails in the Ruby community for a long time. And it exposed a lot of those, again, individual sort of slight differences. It wasn't, again, about the one thing. Just like the cloning of Rails wasn't really about the one scaffolding. It was never about the one issue. It was more of these coming together fundamental streams that we thought really perhaps were all that different. Well, the lucky outcome of the whole Murk thing was that we realized, again, these surface emotions can run very hot. But just as the surface emotion comments on Reddit doesn't really change a whole lot of minds anywhere, the underlying technical aspects or the technical differences between what was Murk and Rails wasn't really that big once you get down to it. And I'll get into that point in a little bit. But the baseline is that we're still here. We're still doing exceptionally well in terms of the amount of new code that's contributed. The rate of improvement is accelerating in the terms of just how much stuff that's going on. But at the same time, we're sort of convening around the same core principles, the same principles that we held 5 years ago. And just because we're still here is not sort of an excuse just to rest on our laurels. And just because we know that most of these internet issues are two-day phenomena doesn't mean we shouldn't learn anything from it and shouldn't take anything away. It just means that chill out, take it easy. Most of these things just doesn't matter as much as you think they matter in the moment. And the core pieces that do matter will be extracted and diffused anyway. All right. So that's really how we came to where we are today. Let's talk about how we're going to move forward. So let's talk about the philosophy of Rails 3. Because I think, as we were talking about, what really matters in all of this is recognizing the things that make us who we are in a Rails community. It's not necessarily just the minor technical improvements. It's the fundamental philosophies that we all share and that we feel are important enough that it's worth rallying about for half a decade. Now, the first philosophy of Rails 3 is it's one that's really been true always. We're going to lock up all the unicorns. Rails 3 is not going to be a complete rewrite. It's not going to solve everybody's problems. Most people will walk away from Rails 3 thinking, why didn't it do that one thing I also wanted it to do? And I think in order to not get trapped in Perl 6-ism, you sort of have to just upfront recognize the fact that you're just not going to get all those wonderful unicorns out their cages. It's not going to happen. You can't please everybody all the time, and you can't even please yourself most of the time. Wait a minute, that came out wrong. Never mind. Anyway, no unicorns. But no holy cows either. So at the same time as you're saying, we're not going to just let ourselves be sucked into this world of all the magical possibilities that would be available to us if we just had horn in our foreheads, we're also not going to look at anything we have and feel that, like, that is the way it has to be. And I think that this was really one of those core mistakes, probably, that the Rails group and I, in many ways, perhaps expounded, was that there was all of these fundamental truths to what made Rails Rails that couldn't be questioned. And that led to a lot of the Murk thing, because we clashed on things where we thought we were just so different on a so fundamental level that none of it could be reconciled. And I think that that's really the danger of treating any one aspect of who you are or what you are as a permanent fixture of your identity. So we're trying to get away from that. We're trying to get away from the holy cows that there isn't anything that can't be changed. Let's take a very concrete example. So alias method chain, for example, for a long time became this sort of lightning rod of debate of how you should do metaprogramming or building up a lot of these infrastructure level things, and it sounded like an holy cow, but who cared really? I sure as hell didn't. The only thing I cared about was turning it out to be something better. So let that be a sort of a public service announcement that there's nothing that's sacred in Rails. Everything is always up for debate. If you want to break every single Rails application out there because you have a great idea for Rails 3, it's absolutely on the table. Your arguments have to be overwhelmingly good to do that. We're absolutely not going to willy-nilly just break things, but it has to be on the table. If you go into any negotiation with reserved issues, things that can never be discussed, that's just not going to lead to any sort of productive environment for moving forward. So let's dig in even deeper and go even more concrete into this stuff. So if we're not going to have holy cows, and we're not going to let the unicorns out of the gates, at least we can make some tasty burgers. And I think that have it your way is such a wonderful slogan that I've assumed to be probably the driving theme or the driving notion for how we can gel all of these different approaches from Murk and from Rails into Rails 3. So to me, have it your way means if I walk into Burger King and I order a Whopper, how many questions am I asked about what I want in that Whopper? Very little at all. If I just want a freaking burger, I'm going to get a freaking burger. Now, if you don't like pickles, you can go up there and say, hey, give me a burger without pickles. Now, I love pickles. Is my burger going to be worse because you don't want pickles in your burger? No, of course not. Just because we have these individual minor differences doesn't mean we can't all come together around the love of bad junk food, right? Just because you have some things that you want to change doesn't make what I have any worse. At least when it comes to sort of the statement of have it your way, Burger King style. When I first came to the US, one of the things I deeply despised was the notion of construction kit food, where I'd go in somewhere and I would order a burger and it would come in pieces. And I would have to assemble it all by myself. I hate that stuff. When I just want something to eat, I want a prepared meal. I don't want to be the cook. I want somebody else to make all of those choices for me, except if I have something I really care about. And I think that parallel actually applies perfectly to web development and web frameworks. Because most of the time, for most of the people, they just want to eat. They just want to get their applications done. They don't have any fundamental grievances with pickles. So they'll take it as it is. Now, I think that's probably the key point of where we came out of the whole Murk thing with that difference, that we can melt these two things together, that we can allow people to make their individual choices and still be together in one community, and I think be a much better off for it. All right, let's go into some of the concrete pieces of progress we have in Rails 3. Back, I think, in January or December when we were announcing the whole merge thing, we were talking about having an alpha release at RailsConf, just as a big overarching target. Well, we're not going to have an alpha release in the sense of a finished gem. What we do have is actually a ton of code for Rails 3 that's already in the repository. I'm going to give you sort of a little bit of a tour on just 5 major themes from that. But a lot of this stuff is already in the code base. It's already there for you to give a spin and try it out. But we don't have anything yet we want to slap a name on a gem for. Let's dig into the router. So the router in Rails has a really long storied history. And I think it's one of those funny things where somebody was talking about the other day where it seems like a rite of passage. Whenever we get somebody new into the Rails core group, the first job is to rewrite the router. And that has seemed to be true for a long time. But we're trying to do it one more time. And this time, taking a lot of the ideas out of the Murk router, it had a lot more ideas on how you could reroute on very specific things such as subdomains and user agents and so forth. A lot of these features. And I think those features, they're great. I welcome them, and it's going to be interesting. For me, it's not that much of a driving difference. I wasn't missing that much, but I'll get to that in 1 second. We're also, of course, trying to always make things faster. A lot of the new work on Rails 3 is not necessarily user-visible work, but under-the-cover stuff. And finally, the whole rack thing, where rack is this shared standard of interoperabilities between Ruby web frameworks. We're going to sort of try to bake that into the router in a way that you can mount multiple apps at the same time. We just had a discussion about this yesterday with some of the core group people, and I believe that Yehuda and Carl is actually doing a session either today or tomorrow or another day, during RailsConf on how this is going to work, how you can mount multiple applications at the same time, which I think is goes again into the spirit of have it your way. If you have a part of a Rails application that you just want to do in Sinatra, we've even talked about what if you had a part of your application that you wanted to do in Django. You wanted to use their geo-IP stuff, and you had just one part of your application you could do that. Is there some way that we could make that all live happily under the same roof? Well, all those things are interesting. What's interesting to me and what I often care deeply about is API design. So the Rails routing API hasn't changed for a very long time. If you look here at just a simple definition, I know it's sort of hard to see in the back. It doesn't really matter too much. These things aren't neither nailed in stone or that critical. You see how we're declaring login, logout, the creates, the methods, and the get. And some of this stuff is currently a bit cumbersome because it dates for an era before REST, before we kind of embrace these principles more fully. So some of the things we're trying to do is promote some of the underlying aspects into more first-class elements. What you're seeing below is just one sort of idea, an outcast for how this stuff could work, where we're sort of bubbling up some of the patterns, extracting some of the principles we're already seeing in route declaration files and bringing them up to the surface. Sort of like with options, which is just a generic Ruby way of declaring a certain key value pairs on an existing configuration hash, bubble that up and say, all right, if everybody's doing this all the time, maybe that should just be a primary function to do. Another example, of course, is the declaration of the resources themselves. These lines have a tendency to get very long. Projects, resources, companies, has many people, has one avatar. All of this stuff is in some ways bolted on. Because when I first started working with REST, we weren't necessarily sure the experiment was going to work. And that's how it goes with a lot of things. So we weren't going to change how everybody was doing everything if this experiment didn't work. We've had plenty of experiments in the past that didn't work. Components came to mind, where we have changed everybody's sort of approach to the development of Rails applications, it would all have been for nothing. But now that we're reasonably sure that REST is here to stay, we can go further, and we can sort of bubble these things up again. Here's just one example, again, of some resource codes that declared in a more sort of explicit manner. One of the other things you'll notice here is instead of going off a yielded object using map or projects in the top examples, how we're doing it now, we're sort of playing with one of those things that was actually a holy cow for some time in the Rails development world, which is instant eval, where the DSL doesn't come off from a single root object. It's not method calls off a single root object. As you can see in the top example, the map and the projects, those are the root objects that you call methods on. And that's usually my preferred style of doing things. And when I first saw this outcast from, I think Carl was showing me some code from the Murk router, it was like, I had just had a gut-level reaction. This is not what we do. We don't use instant eval. We can't do that. And the more I looked at more examples, I started writing my own sample code with it, and I started going through all the different cases of, okay, why is it that I don't like instant eval? Well, one of the primary things is that I don't like it when you need to use it along with a lot of other traditional Ruby code. It becomes sort of unclear what's the instant eval call. Is something being bubbled down, or is this the primary call or not? So that was one of the gut-level reactions I found, or when I dug deeper. And what I realized was I was looking at a lot of routes files. How much actual Ruby was I putting in there that wasn't just the resource declarations? And I found I wasn't really putting anything in there. And if I was putting something in there, it was something like with options, patterns that would repeat themselves and could be extracted to a higher level. So this is probably one of the clearest examples of how we're revisiting, holy cow, the no instant eval in Rails DSLs, and sort of thinking, does this still make sense? We're still questioning this. Is this still good? And who knows? These are still just sketches of how things could be, but I enjoy the aesthetics of the new example, the lower example, a lot more than the aesthetics of the top one. One other interesting, just quick point on this is the bottom example is actually longer. If you count the number of lines, it looks like it's more expansive, but to me it's a lot easier to understand, which is, of course, that Ruby is not just all about having fewer lines of code, it's about having more expressive lines of code. Now, another major thing, and another, in fact, holy cow, that we're revisiting for Rails 3 is the question of cross-site scripting attacks. So cross-site scripting attacks, just as a brief reminder, is when you allow somebody to inject JavaScript code into your public pages, and then they can do all sorts of nasty things of stealing other people's cookies and so on and so forth. And for a very long time, the position has been, yes, that is a real problem, and it's a real problem for you to deal with. You'll have to be explicit about countering this. If, for example, say you have this blog engine and you're outputting comments, you shouldn't allow people to have their rogue JavaScript in that. So by default, nothing is escaped, because we were of the opinion that people would escape this by hand and they would do their due diligence. And if we all did it by just automatically, it would be too heavy, or it would require too many resources and be too slow. So you had to do this H thing. Now, I looked through one of my applications recently and found there was actually a fair number of spots where I forgot this, because this is not a natural thing for you to think about always. What you really want to think about is doing the opposite. You want to think about when it's okay for somebody to inject, for example, JavaScript into your code. So for Rails 3, we're flipping the convention around. We're flipping it around in such a way that by default, all output in views will be escaped. And if you do not want this to happen, you'll have to say raw. So before we had it, nothing is escaped by default. Now you say H to escape it. With Rails 3, everything is going to be escaped by default, and you'll say raw when you don't want it to be escaped. And this is actually one of those things where we didn't revisit this for a long time. We had this holy cow base assumption that couldn't work, it'd be too cumbersome or whatever. And then the Django guys did this not too long ago. They just changed over, and their world didn't stop. It still worked. They still produced great applications. So none of these sort of doomsday scenarios we might have had in our mind didn't play out. And when we realized that that's just a good idea, I mean, by all means, take advantage of that. So we have. Now, one thing about this is how do you sort of deal with the things you didn't want escaped? So the Rails helpers themselves are going to do this. All the HTML helpers are going to automatically know that they're safe. So if you're calling contact tag or any of the other tags that take some user input, it's already going to know this. If you want to do it yourself, we've come up with this notion of HTML safe, where you can mark a string as being safe for output without being escaped. As you see, the first helper, the safe helper, just uses built-in tags from Rails, content tag and tag. They'll automatically know that they are safe and they can be outputted. If you're mixing it yourself with just a random string, you will have to mark it as such. So this is probably going to be the change that requires the most work on this aspect in your Rails application as you upgrade it to Rails 3, is that you have to mark all of these things yourself to HTML safe. But I absolutely have become convinced that the trade-off is worth it. I didn't used to think so, but now I do. All right. Another major thing, and it goes on the theme again of the having your way thing, is JavaScript. So JavaScript is one of those aspects, probably along with testing, where there's the most legitimate difference of opinion as to what library or what framework you should be using. And Rails, for a long time, has just scooted over that, sort of saying you can do whatever you want. If you want to change prototype out for, say, jQuery, or if you want to change test unit out for RSpec, you can do that. But sort of the onus is on you to figure out how that is going to work out. Well, starting with JavaScript, there's been some sort of fairly recent development in the way JavaScript libraries work and how you can bind certain events to the DOM that allows us to have the best of everything. So a couple of years ago, this notion of unobtrusive JavaScript bubbled up, where unobtrusive JavaScript means you're not going to put explicit JavaScript functions inside of your HTML. So you're not going to do all these on-click things. Instead, you're going to pull it out, and you're going to put it into its own JavaScript file, and you're then going to include that JavaScript file, and that's how it's going to work. Well, I thought that sounded like a great idea in theory and a horrible idea in practice, because it required me to do all that work. It required me to explicitly separate the JavaScript from the code it was relevant to. It now went into this external file. I had to maintain that, and that just seemed incredibly yucky to me. So, like, principle, great idea. Don't get JavaScript into your HTML. You get cleaner HTML. You get sort of a range of other principles. But overriding principle, it's going to hurt me to write code like this. I'm not going to be willing to accept that trade. Well, the wonderful thing is that we can now get sort of both of these things for free. Now, I don't know how well you can see this, but I'll talk it out anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Link to remote is a helper we have in Rails. So if you do link to remote delete, we're going to inline sort of convert that to an href that has a unclick, explicit, or obtrusive piece of JavaScript that calls an AJAX request right there and sort of figures out what to do from there. And this kind of code, I mean, when it's just in that level, yeah, all right, it's not the greatest, but how much does it really matter? Well, it matters when you can get something much nicer for free. So what we're going to do in Rails 3 is we're going to do two things. First, we're going to adopt the HTML5 standard approach to how to have custom attributes. So with HTML5, there's this new convention of how you can say data-something, and you can get your custom attribute in there, and it will still validate. So you can now have an href that has a data-remote equals true, and also a data-method equals delete for this delete link. And we now have two pieces of identification in the DOM that we can look for with our sort of generic JavaScript that can hook this in. Because most of the time, we're doing the same stuff anyway. When you want a delete link, you just want to call an AJAX request that sends it as a delete HTTP verb against the href. So this pattern is the same over and over again. What we were doing before was basically we were never making any methods. We were writing every single piece of code over and over and over again. You didn't have to write it manually, but it did come out that way in your HTML. The same thing we're going to do for remote form 4, going to turn it into just form 4. And actually, part of this pattern is that let's just cut out sort of the duplication of all of these helpers such that we don't have separate helpers for whether something is remote or whether it's not remote. Whether something is remote or not is actually just an HTML5 attribute away. And then we'll have some overarching generic piece of JavaScript that can hook it all together and make it all work. Some even worse elements here. Here's an example of just how much HTML is spit out when you do a regular link to delete, but you want the method to be a delete verb and not just a get or not just a post. It's actually a truckload of code that's being inserted into your page, and it's not very pretty to look at. We can do exactly the same thing so incredibly cleanly by just marking that href with a data-method delete. And then again, have this generic piece of code pick it up and work with it. Here's another example with the confirm. It's the same thing. Here's the piece of code that makes it work for Prototype. I had Sam write this up the other day. It's really very simple. Both Prototype and jQuery now have a way of observing all these top-level events, such as a click on a single DOM element, and then say, if this element, for example, has data-remote, let's intercept the event. Let's not make the click go through as it normally would, and let's turn it into an AJAX request instead. And this piece of, what I love about this is just, it's this piece of generic code that we can write once in sort of a prototype JavaScript driver and just forget about it. And we won't see all this stuff in our code anymore. jQuery has the same thing. And the wonderful thing here is like, we get these two things for free now. We get unobtrusiveness just by using these attributes instead of having explicit code injected into all of the HTML, which is kind of yucky. So getting that for free, awesome. The declarations themselves, whether you say data-remote, there's nothing prototype specific about that. There's nothing even jQuery specific about that. But both of the libraries can realize it and use it straight up. So we can just have these individual drivers, just like we have database drivers that know how to talk active records into dealing with Oracle, even though that's a tough job. You can do that with all of the JavaScript libraries. So we could have MooTools, or we could have any of the others, just write this one wrapper, and we can get it all for free. And even more so, for example, the confirm example, where we have this one pop-up, are you sure you want to delete this? Maybe instead of just having that as just a regular JavaScript pop-up, you can write your own piece of code that will make it into a full-fledged form dialog that's styled in your own way. So there's really a lot of really cool benefits to this, and this is pretty exciting. More agnosticism. There's more of these things. Have it your way. If you want to use something else in ActiveRecord, we've been working on something called Action ORM, which is actually a very, very slim proxy wrapper around other ORM tools that makes them appear as though they were ActiveRecord when they're interacting with ActionPack, such that you can say form for person, and that person is a data mapper object, or it's a SQL object. And actually, these ORMs have very little differences, meaningful differences, when it comes to how they're displayed and how you deal with them, that we just need to wrap in as a proxy. Generators is another thing. So this is more along the lines of where we said before. If you want to use RSpec, hey, go right ahead, but you sort of have to hack it in all by yourself. If we could just make the generators more agnostic in the sense that it's very easy to plug in and say, using the template, for example, the new templating stuff we got in Rails 2.3, this Rails project is going to be tested with RSpec. Of course, when you say that, it makes sense that when you run the generate a new model generator, that it should generate RSpec, and that should be a lot easier to do. This is actually, the generator stuff is a summer of code project that somebody's doing, which is just more filling in all of these elements. And finally, which is actually where the bulk of the work is in places where most people probably won't notice it. It's all of this great refactoring work that's been going on for a long time, where especially Josh and a bunch of the Murk guys, Yehuda and Carl and others, have been working on just cleaning up a bunch of the internals of Rails, things that perhaps haven't been touched in a long time or just didn't work right, and making them a lot better. One of the concrete aspects of that is something called abstract controller, which is an idea from the Murk guys, where you'd the same infrastructure for writing action mailers, for example, as you do for writing the controllers themselves, and thus you would share all the capabilities of how do you deal with layouts and how do you deal with all these things. Action relation, I think that's actually active relation. I think that's wrong, is a new way of underpinning ActiveRecord, or trying to, more using relational algebra, where Currently, a lot of the ways we're doing it internally in ActiveRecord stems back from the very early days of me not even knowing what relational algebra was and just mashing strings together. And in some ways, it's surprising how well that has worked, but I'm sure there's definitely a better way to do it. ActiveSupport will offer some new ways of cherry picking where you can use parts of ActiveSupport instead of loading in the full bulk of it. And a lot of these things are actually already true in master. I know that ActiveSupport is already very cherry pickable. It's going to be even more so. And Yehuda spent a bunch of time speeding up callbacks as another example of this stuff. And this is actually where a lot of the work has gone into so far, and perhaps partly responsible why we don't have a lot of other flashy features of Rails 3 to demonstrate, because we're spending so much time on basically doing a snow leopard release of cleaning up so many of the internals. Now, all of this stuff and looking at what we have in Rails 3 and how Rails 3 is really different from Rails 0.5, which was the first release, made me think back about the beginning, the genesis of all of this. The genesis of Rails being about productivity. The genesis of Rails being about me working on a project called Basecamp all by myself, having 10 hours per week to work on something and just not being able to use anything else but something very, very productive. And I was thinking back as to, I was looking at this old Rails code and thinking back of, well, I mean, what we're doing now is definitely better, it's definitely smoother, but there's really not that much of a difference. And I was then thinking to some of the conversations I've had with other Rails developers and trying to reconcile how it was that in the early days, I was able to get so much mileage out of just those 10 hours per week I was spending on Basecamp. And maybe if I, in fact, had misattributed a fair amount of that productivity to just Rails itself. And even though Rails is definitely a lot more productive than most other platforms I know of, and I was happy using it, I started to think more deeply about what were the elements and the principles that made me feel so incredibly productive in those early days, and how somehow I've not been able to reclaim that initial burst of productivity to the same level. And as I thought about that, there was one thing that popped out of me, one principle that I realized that was really key to making me feel the most productivity that I could and get the most out of the door as soon as possible. And that notion is the notion of renegotiating requirements. What I've realized is that most developers really treat requirements as stone tablets coming down from above with commandments of what it is that they're supposed to do. And this goes for even so-called agile developers who are doing all these otherwise clever tricks of trying to squeeze out more productivity from daily hours. They're doing iterations, they're doing all of these things. But there's not been a whole lot of talk in my mind about maybe you shouldn't accept these stone tablets. Maybe what they're telling you is not really what's the best thing to do. Maybe this isn't the road for you to take right now. And as I was thinking back on the Basecamp days, the key answer that came up was, what were we talking about when we were talking about new features, as things we wanted to extend? And the answer was mostly just, I don't think so, or no. Let's do something else instead. Renegotiating what we thought that the application should actually do. Now that's, in my mind, where the real productivity is to be gained. Not accepting requirements as they come down from whoever your stakeholder is and just treating them as gospel. Because most of the time, people aren't really that attached to them. It's, I think, a personality flaw of most programmers to just accept it like that instead of going back and renegotiating what that contract should look like. Let's take an example here. So I'm feeling I have a sweet tooth. I want some chocolate, right? So I'm dreaming up, like, what's the most delicious chocolate that I could have? Let me get some fine Belgium chocolate. Well, I have to probably go all the way down to get it. It's probably going to cost me $50 or something else like that. And I have to make the trip back. So now I have this desire, I want something, and I'm formulating it in a very specific way because that's how most people operate. They talk about something in concrete terms, even though there's just sort of trying to relate an overarching fuzzy idea of what they want. And what I realized is that it's pretty rare they actually bother to take the trip downtown to actually buy fine Belgian chocolate. Oftentimes, I'll discover a Twix in my pocket, and I'll eat that instead. And at the end of it, it's pretty much all the same. I got chocolate. I'm no longer hungry for chocolate, even though I didn't get nearly exactly what I wanted. Actually, calling both of these things chocolate is probably a grave insult to the Belgium guys. But the point is, it doesn't really matter most of the time. But we see all of these requirements for fine Belgian chocolate as being that specific things that people want, that they can only be satisfied by fine Belgian chocolate, which is, of course, not true. Just giving them a Twix every now and then is going to be so much faster and cheaper to do. And most of the time, they're not going to care. But we have this notion as programmers that we still want to be loved. We want to be that puppy that's fetching the ball over and over, no matter how many times it's being thrown, or where, in the mud, or so forth. And I think that this is not a very suiting image for us. I think we can change in ways where we're not just that puppy, we're somebody who barks back. We're not somebody who just obediently does everything that's coming down as requirements. We try to renegotiate them, and we try to see how many times we can get away just giving people Twix instead of fine Belgian chocolate. Let me give you one example of this. So the funny thing is that in my mind, when we built Basecamp at 37 Signals, we had it all right. And we had it all right not because we were terribly smart, but because we were forced to have it all right, because we had the 10 hours per week. We had a tiny team. We were all doing other things. We didn't have a big budget. Now, problem comes that Basecamp became a fairly successful product, and all of a sudden we did have time. All of a sudden we could throw more people at the problem. And the natural instinct just sucked us back into that notion. So when we were building Highrise, which is another product as 37 Signals, which is sort of like a CRM-ish tool, we needed a permission system. And as all programmers know, permission systems are the bane of our existence. And the requirements at first for that permission system was for fine Belgium chocolate. It needed to be infinitely configurable. We had this notion of you had people in your Highrise account and you had groups. And you should be able to combine them in any way you wanted. Let me invite to see this note in Highrise, I just want Jeremy to see it, I want the partners to see it, and I want something else to see it. You can do any mix of this stuff as you wanted to. I tried to implement that over a course of, I think, 2 weeks, and it sucked. Because trying to do the infinitely flexible permission model is really hard work. You can't just hard-code things in, because when you have all these many-to-many relationships, what you end up with is all of these many-to-many joins. And many-to-many joins are horribly slow, and they're hard to keep updated, and so on and so forth. And I gave up. I basically just told Jason at the time, this is too fucking hard. No, I don't have the patience to do this. I'm just not going to wrap it up, dude. It's not going to happen. Let's figure something else out. So what we figured out was the problem domain became infinitely easier to deal with by making one tiny change. The tiny change was there's only 3 states or 4 states of permission. Either everybody can see it, there's no permissions on it. You can see it, hard-coding you as being a user ID straight on that note, or a group can see it. Now, the way we get then people in, just random people, you pick out 3 from the 10 you have in your account and make them see it, is you bundle all of these together in, we call that anonymous groups. So you either had everybody, one guy, or a group. Now, all of these things could be hard-coded on the individual record. It wasn't nearly as flexible, but it was stupidly simple to do. It was very fast. And in the end, we got roughly the same thing. This was pretty much his answer at the end of it. Sure, whatever. I don't care. That sounds fine. Let's just go with that. The difference between those two implementations was monumental. One thing I had failed spending 2 weeks working on. The other thing took me a day and a half. And this is what I mean about if you can do that on a sustained basis, if you can renegotiate your requirements like that, no framework can keep up with that. There's no way that Rails can be made so productive that solving the same set of requirements can now be done in 1.5 days instead of 2 weeks. Just not going to happen. So the most powerful tool you have to increase your productivity is this notion of just renegotiating the requirements, accepting that most of the time people will be fine with just Twix, and realizing that all of these excuses that you feel internally when you're working on something, because I feel these all the time. I don't know how to do this. Oh, this looks pretty hard. Oh my God, this is going to be so much work. I'm going to be bored out of my mind. Or I have this really pretty abstraction now. If you introduce that case, my abstraction is going to break and I have to redo everything. Now, the natural instinct for programmers is to put on his cape and go hero style on it, right? Like all of these excuses are just unprofessional sort of excuses for not doing the real work we should be doing, right? We want to be the hero and the puppy, or the puppy hero. And I just think that really is not very good for anybody, because you're thinking that you're doing people a service here. You're thinking that just because you're trying to solve their stone tablets, that they're somehow going to be ultimately grateful for you. Chances are they won't. Chances are they will have forgotten next week what they asked you to do the previous week, and nobody cares. So it's just not worth busting yourself over this or wearing your underpants and the outsides of your trousers to get work done. Because it usually goes like this. So you have motivation and you have time, and it feels really good to accept that hard challenge, to accept those impossible odds, to just suppress all of your internal objections of, I don't know how to do this would be too hard in the beginning. But it peaks very, very quickly. And after that, your motivation is just going to drop to the floor, which is exactly what happened to me when I was working on the high-rise permission system. It actually didn't take 2 weeks. It took 1.5 weeks, and then I just spent 2 days goofing around. Because by the end of the 1.5 weeks, I had all of these objections coming internally saying, this is too hard, this is not going to work, this is going to be too slow, and then that's really depressing. And what happens when something is really depressing? We step away from what's depressing, and we start working on something else. And that's how lots of projects just drag on forever and ever and ever, because the programmers are no longer motivated. They no longer believe in themselves that they can actually do this. But they try to keep up the cape. They try to keep up the happy smile and do it anyway. And it just doesn't work. And it's no good for anybody. And finally, I think that this comes just from, in part, the language that we have. Calling people programmers, that sounds like a black box. It sounds like it's something that accepts requirements as input, and it outputs complete programs. And I think we're not those boxes. Those boxes would not be affected by such petty human emotions as being demotivated or bored. So it's not a useful metaphor for us to deal with. And the sooner we get rid of that, the better. I like to think of it as we're being partners in this. We're trying to work with whoever our stakeholders are, designers, or whoever's writing the requirements or determining what this should be, that we're partners in figuring out how we can just get by with this faster, how we can remap things like I did with the permission system into a 1.5 day effort and not spend 2 weeks on it. All right. Thanks very much. That's my talk, but I actually do have time for questions this time around. So there's 2 mics in the middle of the room, so if you have a question, do walk up to a mic, and I'll try my best to answer it. Thank you.
What happens on legacy browsers with the new spiffier data dash attributes on forms and links?
What happens to what?
Legacy browsers. Does IE6 support that? I would assume not. Probably keels over.
Oh, I actually don't know how that's all gonna work out. But I'm sure it will. Which is actually another funny realizations I've had with a lot of this internal stuff is that I no longer know how everything works in Rails. So you shouldn't feel too bad about not knowing it either. Because it actually doesn't really matter most of the time. And what I found is that I just need to know about the things that I care about in that moment. And I'll work on improving it while I care about it, and then I'll move on to something else, and I'll forget something about it. And that's okay. We don't need to know everything about everything all the time. And I think that major guilt complex is a big part of why people have this inferiority complex. They think every other programmer is smarter than them and have kept up with more stuff than them, and it's just not true. Most of it is just faking it as we go along. Any other questions? Got one coming there.
I had a question about Murb and Rails and the merger. Who kind of approached who, and what's the backstory for that?
So the way the whole merge worked was it came to down to the Cuba Missile Crisis. In terms of the sense that tensions were running really high in the beginning of December. Everybody was getting more and more agitated, and we were considering all sorts of nuclear war alternatives. And we realized, just keeping the hand on that red trigger button, that maybe we should just talk to each other. Maybe that would be a good start before we nuked everything into a wasteland. And we did that. I think at some point we had a discussion with Yehuda and other people, and we started discussing the real issues. What are our core differences here? For so long, there had been so much posturing about what the supposedly differences were between the two approaches. So we sat down and we started discussing actual technical differences, not the high-level stuff of philosophies of, I want to be able to cherry-pick my own framework. No, you should just get all my choices all the time. That's not how I talk most of the time. But we went into the technical details, and we realized we weren't all that different. In fact, we weren't different at all, it almost seemed. And once we came to that realization, everything was really easy. If we could just boil arguments down to technical differences and just change those differences and do it under the banner of have it your way, all of a sudden, all of the other proxy wars kind of fell apart because they just weren't necessary. And we realized instead of working all this duplication, we could all be working together on the same thing and for the betterment of, I think, the community and so forth.
Hi there. I just had a question about basically where Rails is going, especially in Rails 3, with all the options and the cherry picking. I mean, I'm excited about it, but I guess coming to Rails a couple of years ago from the other frameworks, one of the things I did sort of like is that it boxed me in. And,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's probably the most important concern I've had of anything going into Rails 3.
Yes.
That we should not devolve back into a configuration hell.
Yes.
So that's why I found that slogan of having it your way so powerful for me to sort of illustrate what's going on, that you don't have to pick your burger if you don't want to. And that we're going to have the default set of what Rails does and what it comes with is always going to kick ass. Because, in part, because that's going to be exactly what I use, and I want something that kicks ass. So that's going to be really, really good. And of all the decisions we make going into that, all the decisions we make of opening things up to other choices has to come under sort of the big cloud of the default road has to rock.
Yes.
And this has only to be for people who actually truly are very passionate about alternatives. It's not to sort of confuse everybody coming into Rails. Then the first thing they have to consider is, oh, what JavaScript library am I going to use? Or what testing facility am I going to use? All these things, in the grand scheme of things, just doesn't matter.
Because I think you were right when you just said passion with those choices. Because what I find is people do get passionate about which choice they want to take. they haven't actually maybe even done the research as to this one's going to work better than that one. So.
Sure. And I think that's actually wonderful. I think that a lot of the things that are coming out of this is, in some ways, expanding the Rails tent a little bit in the terms of having divergent opinions inside of it is a good thing. Yeah. That we can disagree and debate over testing tools, but at the same time, we can just, a lot of people say, all right, we're just still going to use the same action pack. We're going to share the 97% of things where we have the exact same opinion about things, and the last 3%, it's okay to be different. It's okay to have a different opinion on things. It's not going to ruin the relationship of how we work together.
Okay. Hi, I have a question about productivity, and it was very interesting to me to hear that you spend 10 hours per project in a week. And this means that you work on many projects per week, maybe 3 or so. And for me, we are working per iterations. This means 2 weeks only this project, then we switch to other projects. And after once, we have many projects, but one project is behind the other because we spend the other project after 4 weeks, for example. So it is better to work on many projects per week, or only 1 week, one project? What's your opinion?
So I think it's absolutely better to work serially, where you work on one thing at the time. The problem with that is that it's very sometimes hard to time box that appropriately. So even though you're just working on one thing at a time, when you start doing that, it's very easy to give that a lot more leeway. Instead of something where you just before had 10 hours to work on something because it was mixed in through other things, you saw all of a sudden now you have 100 hours to work on something. And that's where the problem is. I totally believe that you shouldn't be context and task switching all the time. It's very harmful to productivity. You should be focusing on one thing for as long as you could to kind of get it out of the way. But, I mean, it is a trade-off in the sense that you just don't get the same natural boundaries. When I was working 10 hours per week, it wasn't because I've chosen to work 10 hours per week. It sounded like way too little at the time. It was because I was going to school. It was because I had other client projects. It was because I was forced to do that. So in my mind, it's more about trying to work serially and trying to get super tight time boxes on things that forces you to make choices. Because most of these choices of renegotiating the requirements and so on, they just don't come up by themselves. You need to force them to a head because you do not have enough time to do it. So I think the greatest danger to most projects is having too much time. It's not having not enough. Everybody's complaining about, oh, I don't have enough time. That's the greatest gift. It means that you actually have some real boundaries. It actually means that you have to make some real trade-offs, and that's where I think the real creativity comes out. All right, I think I'm one more or no? All right, one more question. Last one. Make it good.
Hey, David. Well, I don't know if it'll be good. You might have spoken on this before, but I'm just curious what the Rails team's philosophy is and your philosophy on backwards compatibility.
On what?
Backwards compatibility between versions of Rails.
Plugins compatibility, is that what?
Backwards.
Oh, backwards compatibility. I think backwards compatibility is hugely important. I've seen a lot of open source projects sort of go down the flames because they couldn't keep backwards compatibility to just a minimally acceptable level. So I think it's really important. But at the same time, it always has to be on the table. You always have to be open to the possibility that an idea or an approach can be so good that it's worth it. But it has to come with really high costs. So Rails 3 is going to try to be as compatible as possible. Because the problem is that if you don't stay very compatible, if you're just going to go with the unicorn approach of rewriting everything and just, if it breaks, people just won't upgrade. And that doesn't help anybody. It's much easier to deal with a community that's largely on the same version of things. So we definitely take that incredibly seriously. But still being willing to break it when it really matters. Because the flip side of always keeping ultimate backwards compatibility in some ways is Java. And I think that there's a lot of baggage in there that's just, you have to be willing to dump it at some point or another.
Thanks.
All right, thank you very much.